Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History. Okay, yalla. Let's do this. Over the past 24 hours, it feels like history sped up. It feels like it always does. Strikes, retaliation, rumors about leadership targets, internet blackouts, and a region holding its breath. But if we zoom out, and that's what we like to do here at Unpacking Israeli History, this moment did not begin yesterday. It sits on top of decades of revolution, ideology, proxy warfare, intelligence battles, and a regime that has defined itself in opposition to both Israel and the United States. So before we get lost in headlines that may change by the hour, we want to step back and ask some bigger questions. How did we get here? What actually matters structurally? And what should we be watching for that will still be true next week, next month, and maybe even next year? To help unpack this moment, I want to welcome Avi Melamed. Avi Melamed is a geopolitical Middle East expert, intelligence analyst, former Israeli intelligence official, and senior Arab affairs advisor. Avi is the founder of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives, ITME, a nonprofit institute dedicated to apolitical, non-partisan Middle East education, and the author of 3 books on the region. I could not think of a better person to help me understand this moment. Avi, thank you so much. It's 11 a.m. on Sunday right now when you, Avi, and I are recording, and there's so much going on to understand the big picture. I don't want to use your valuable time on the many specific details that might be obsolete 30 minutes after recording. And there are a lot of hot takes right now. What I'd like to do, as my audience knows, is to let ideas breathe and to understand the historical context of this moment. So first of all, I just want to say thank you, Avi, for joining this conversation.
Of course, Noam. Thank you so much for having me.
So what do we actually know about what's going on with Israel and Iran and the United States? And what are some of the biggest unknowns right now from your perspective?
Okay, so we know there is a war going on. It started about almost 48 hours ago. One of the most significant thing, of course, is the killing of the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, an event that has in different levels, a lot of ramifications and significant impact. We could elaborate on that maybe a little bit later on. Regarding your question about what we don't know, I would say a couple of things. First, we don't know exactly uh, at this current phase, what is exactly the next move of the regime, meaning particularly in the context of regrouping itself and restructuring its operation. In that regard, I will mention that one of the people that was mentioned prior to the war as potential heir or candidate to take Khamenei's place was his son, Mushtaba. But there has been conflicting information up until now, arguing that he might have killed as well. I have no verification for that at this point. And another thing that we have to follow also very clearly is the interesting dynamic that has been evolving in the last 24 hours. To sum it up, I would say the war started with a US administration objective that calls for the eliminating the ability of the Iranian regime to have a nuclear capacities and ballistic missile. It seems as if in the last 24 hours there has been some shift in this perspective, and perhaps we are looking at an objective of bringing this regime down, but I have to be very cautious about this estimation at this pace, at this moment. We'll just have to follow the thing to see how things will evolve.
Okay, so let's take a step back and actually understand the history of this moment. You were telling us about the life of Khamenei, which I just say Khomeini. You pronounce it correctly, probably. I know I don't. So I say Khomeini. And I want to understand the history of how we got to this moment. I want you to talk to us a little bit. What happened with the fall of the Shah? How did we get the Islamic Republic we're looking at today? Like, what's the origin story? And what did the US and the UK do to meddle in Iranian affairs in 1953?
Well, Noam, with your permission, I would like to go a little bit back beyond that.
Okay.
Because, one of the things I'm saying is that the Middle East history is the present. And why do I say that? Here is the story. I'm going back to the 7th century when Islam emerged in the Arab Peninsula. Islam emerged and very quickly became a conquering empire. And very quickly there has been a growing power struggle within Islam regarding the question who is entitled to lead this empire. That power struggle resulted in two major camps within Islam. The first one is the Sunnis, who are the majority of Muslims, about 84%. The second camp are the Shiites. By the way, Shia is a word that is similar to the Hebrew word si'ah, which means a political faction. The Shiites argue that leading the Muslim world should be done only by a male descendant of the fourth caliph of the Muslim Caliphate, Ali bin Abi Talib. And the major branch of the Shiites is known as the Twelfth. Why the Twelfth? Because they believe there has been line of 12 spiritual and political leaders, starting with this fourth caliph. They call each and one of them imam, which means a spiritual and political leader. But here is the interesting thing that takes us straight to our time. In the Shiite denomination, the imam is not only a political and spiritual leader, he is connected to a divine source of power, and therefore his rule has to be blindly obeyed. That resulted in one of the most significant narratives of the Shiite, and that is called the ultimate rule of the jurisprudent, meaning that the rule of the jurisprudent has to be blindly obeyed. And that takes us straight to our time in understanding the ultimate power of Ali Khamenei, the late leader of the Iranian regime, the supreme leader. He was actually at that position. That explains, among other things, the fact that he has a totally ultimate rule dictating Iran's path. So this is one thing that's very significant to emphasize. Another thing that is significant to emphasize and yet go back to the core power struggle that I mentioned before within Islam has to do with a major narrative of the Shiites, and that is the narrative that says that the Shiites have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world, and therefore in the Shiite beliefs there is a need for the correction of this injustice. And I'm taking it to our times, and you mentioned the Islamic coup in Iran in 1979. I'm saying Islamic coup, not Islamic revolution, because what happened in Iran with the downfall of the Shah regime, the dynasty of Pahlavi, in 1979, started as an uprising, a popular uprising that was led by progressive and socialist circles.
Hmm.
The Shiite clergy, the mullahs, and back then the founder of the Islamic coup, that is known by the name of Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini, joined that uprising and basically took over from within once the uprising succeeded and actually eliminated their yesterday's power.
But let me interrupt for a second. And in 79, why were they having a revolution? People tend to think that it was an Islamic revolution, but you're pointing out it wasn't initially an Islamic revolution. It became that. It turned into that.
Correct.
What were they revolutionizing? What were they rebelling against?
The story in Iran was that in course of time, Iran always has this interesting mixture of different identities. You got the Shiite components, which majority of the Iranians are, but we have to remember that Iran has many ethnical groups. You got Persians and Baluchis and Kurds and Turkmenistan and Afghans and Arabs and others. But majority of the Iranians are Persians in their ethnicity and Shiite in their denomination. So you got one aspect, but then you got the aspect of Iran as a statehood that has an enormous civilization heritage, as a civilization that was way before Islam emerged. So this is another component. And then you got the component of contemporary times where the Pahlavi and particularly the Shah were kind of like leading a pro-Western openness policy.
Mm.
That was very much something that was limited to a very thin layer of the Iranians, but not appealing to the majority of the people in Iran. And so you got a situation where there was an increasing economic gaps. There were kind of like growing power struggle over traditions and values and customs. And there has been, parallel to that, there has been a growing oppressive mechanism used by the regime, back then the dynasty, to endure its rule. All those things together, roughly speaking, resulted in a growing, I would say, upheaval and unrest within the Iranian people, and that basically burst out in 1979.
Okay, so you were telling me about the distinction between the Sunnis and the Shiites. I want to just hear a little bit more about that. So Khomeini, who took over for, I can't pronounce it as well as you can, another person named Khomeini, So it sounds similar to, but not the exact same. He took over. He's been in charge for the last 36 years, I believe. And you said it was Sunnis versus Shiites. Sunnis represent 84% of the Muslim world, and this supreme leader, Khamenei, has been in charge of the Iranian world, the Shiite world. Do what else are the differences between the Sunnis and Shiites that we should know about?
Well, no, first, let me just help you with the pronunciations of the names because it's significant. The founder of the Islamic coup in 1979 was Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini. By the way, Ruhollah Ayatollah, it's not his name, this is his title. The
Mhm.
Shiite clergies are known as mullahs, and they are structured like officers in the army, if you wish. The highest level is this Ruhollah Ayatollah, which means the spirit of God and the sign of God.
Mm.
His name was Khomeini. The leader of Iran, the supreme leader that was eliminated right now, that came to power in 1989, is Khamenei. And by the way, Khamenei was not a significant cleric. He was not a significant mullah, religious authority. He was a mid-level, sort of speaking. Just the same, you ask me about the Sunnis and the Shiites. The gaps are enormous. Actually, it's not only about theological and cultural and emotional gaps of narratives. It's about not less an endless power struggle that is constantly fueling and fueled by sense of revenge. This is a power struggle that is stretching over centuries. We are looking at something that has started in the 7th century, and today in the Middle East, in the 21st century, you will find in more than one place these expressions of violence, collision between Sunnis and Shiites. The hatred and the animosities is simply unbridgeable. You know, during the war in Syria, for example, there were Shiite militias fighting to save Assad regime, and those Shiite militias were using symbols, Shiite symbols, going all the way back to the 7th century. The same applies on the other camp, the Sunni militant Salafi jihadi groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda that were fighting in Syria. They were using a Sunni ancient symbols, flags, and banners, and so on and so on. So it shows you this is one of the most significant power struggle that shaped the story of the region since the 7th century. And by the way, as I said before, Noam, history is present almost every day. When you look around in the Middle East, you could see how history is very much present. And by the way, it has played an enormous, significantly role in shaping Israel's geostrategical landscape and the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
How so?
When the regime came to power in 1979, that regime, inspired by the sense, as I mentioned before, of a deep injustice that he has been allegedly deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world by the loath Sunnis, that regime basically, to its core, inspired by those narratives, has been leading a very aggressive expansion policy across the region that is known by the name of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And they basically aspire to create what the Jordanian king, the current king Abdullah II, called in 2004 the Shiite Crescent. Later on, he changed it to the Iranian Crescent, but you could see by the definition already right there, you see this tension. Now, remember that majority of the Arab world are Sunnis, and they are, most of them are Arabs in their ethnicities. The Persians in their ethnicities are Persians, and most of them are Shiites. So right there, you got this big collision. And so the Mullah regime is leading this aggressive expansion policy by creating a network of proxies, armed, powerful groups across the region that acts like a semi-state entities. Like, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, probably heard of, or Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, they are also Shiite. Into that story comes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How so? Because the Mullah regime identified the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a very significant hook to harvest political dividend. Why is that? Because in the mindset, politically, emotionally, culturally, of the Arab world, the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very powerful, and the slogan of liberating Palestine is very appealing and compelling to the masses in the Arab world. The Mullah regime very sophisticatedly and cleverly identified that, and the Mullah regime actually positioned itself as the spearhead of the concept of liberating Palestine, basically marketing to the masses in the region that the regime, with its proxies that are going to be known by the name of the axis of resistance, the regime and the axis of resistance, namely Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Iraqi Shiite militias, Houthis in Yemen, they will lead the charge that will bring about the end of the state of Israel and will liberate Palestine. And when you look at the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last couple of decades, you could see the enormous escalation and militarization of the conflict, particularly in the last 2 decades. And the major contributor to that escalation was exactly this axis of resistance, massively armed by the Iranian regime, financed by the Iranian regime, provided with the military know-how. The axis of the resistance, the members of the axis of resistance, particularly Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, has been constantly fueling the escalation of the trajectory of the conflict because they create the ultimate loop. By fueling the conflict and the flames of the conflict, they were able to continue and to market the story to the Arab world that they are going to liberate Palestine. And by continuing to market the slogan, we are going to liberate Palestine, they were able to further fuel the flame of the conflict. You got here a very vicious, sophisticated loop that was created by the Mullah regime under this banner of the resistance and liberating Palestine. So here you see the connection between the story of the Shia and the axis of the Iranian regime, the Mullah regime that came to power in 1979, the story of the axis of resistance and the impact on the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
If you were to look at the Arab world and from a distance, and you would just see that Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have been attacked by Iran. I'm wondering why it is the case that the Arab militia, Shiite militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, also Arabs in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, do they align themselves more with their and Hamas, by the way, who's Sunni in Gaza and the West Bank, do they align themselves more with the, putting aside Hamas for a second, the Shiites and the Iranian leadership, or do they align more with their Arab ethnic brothers and who have just been attacked?
It's excellent question, Noam. I'll try to answer that and also bring into that the story of Hamas. As you mentioned accurately, Hamas is not Shiites, they are Sunnis. The Palestinians are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. The answer is that all of those factors, both the Shiite one, like Hezbollah, Houthis, by the way, the Houthis are coming from an interesting branch of sort of like very local domestic Shiism, sort of speaking, which we'll not find in any other place, the Zaidi denomination, the Iraqi Shiite militias, Islamic Jihad in Palestine, the Dar Sunnis as well, like Hamas. The common denominator when we are talking about those groups is that they are all subject to a mega structures, ideological mega structures that are basically in their roots has 2 major characteristics. One, they are globalist in their vision, and 2, they are totally rejecting the concept of a modern statehood. Let me say a few words about the globalist expansion of this mega entity. Both Sunnis ideological factors like Hamas or Islamic Jihad as well as Shiite affiliated factors like Hezbollah or the Iraqi Shiite militias, are envisioning the creation of a global Islamic entity. In the Shiite version, it's called imamate, after the term imam that I've explained before. And in the Sunni version, it's called the caliphate. And its most well-known representative of the Sunni camp is the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is basically presenting itself as offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood. So both those factors, the Sunnis and the Shiites, are envisioning the creation of a global Islamic entity, either in the Shiite version or in the Sunni version, where people live their life according to the Islamic faith and codex, the Sharia law. They both reject the concept of national statehood. So all in all, when you're talking about it, asking why they are affiliating with the regime and such ideologies, it's about identity. In other words, they prioritize their Islamic denomination, whether as Shiites in the case of Hezbollah or the Iraqi Shiite militias, or Sunnis in the case of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They prioritize their religious identity over their identity as a civilians or citizens in a concept of a statehood, and they prioritize their ideological vision over the well-being of the state that they are a part of. You see that very clearly in the story of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. You see that to a certain extent in the context of the Shiites in Iraq. In the context of the Houthis, it's a little bit different story. You see that as well in the context of Hamas, the Sunnis, or Islamic Jihad, the Sunnis. Hamas conducted the coup in 2007, in a violent military coup in 2007 in Gaza Strip, terminating violently the rule of its brothers, the Palestinian Authority, because Hamas, in the end of the day, ideologically, doesn't see a Palestinian state that will be built upon the ruins of the state of Israel, as Hamas called for. It sees it only as a station towards the next station, and the next station, and the final destination is the creation of a caliphate. So we are looking at a common denominator of those Sunnis and Shiites groups that are prioritizing components of identities that in the end of the day are colliding with the concept of a national statehood.
And the Saudis, where do they fit into this? Do they not want that caliphate? Are they as oppositional to this caliphate as Israel is and the United States of America are? Where do the Saudis fit into this?
Let's start with the fact that the Saudis are the custodians of the 2 out of the 3 holy sites of the Muslim world in Mecca and Medina. They are considered to be the leaders of the Sunni camp, particularly, of course, in the region in the Middle East, particularly in the last years against the background of the crisis across the Middle East of Arab states and the whole concept of statehood. Now, the Saudis, it's very interesting because the Saudi monarchy basically was built to a large extent on a combination of a political power, traditional structure, fabric, and dogmatic, very, very conservative religious thought. The Salafi thought, the Wahhabi thought that evolved in Saudi Arabia basically laid, to a certain extent, the foundation for modern times, creation of the Salafi jihadi groups that we are witnessing, those groups that are coming from the womb of the Sunni camp. The Saudis, of course, are Sunnis. Now, Saudi Arabia, in the last couple of years, is going through some very interesting transitional phase, mostly attributed to the growing influence of the Saudi heir, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. And it's very interesting to watch the process happening in Saudi Arabia because it involves, in the most deeper level, I would say, it involves some sort of like trying to change a mindset of a society that is traditionally, to its bone, is based upon very ultra-conservative perspectives. And there are ultra-conservative power bases within the Saudi monarchy. Now, Mohammed bin Salman is leading an interesting process in a different expressions, roughly speaking, that can be characterized as growing openness. But when you look at those changes, those sometimes dramatic changes, I mean, who could ever thought that in Saudi Arabia you will find an exhibition of women swimwear? This was something unthinkable, you know?
Right.
But when you see this thing happens, you see these concerts of rock stars coming from the West to Saudi Arabia, and you see the reaction of the generation, you are looking at a very interesting shift. Now, this is a huge dragon that once is set off to its way, I don't want to say exactly who can and to what extent control it. But it's interesting to see that happening in front of our eyes. It seems like, at this point at least, this is a very structured, calculated, monitored process that the Mohammed bin Salman and his power base are leading in Saudi Arabia. But I would definitely say that one of the most significant centers of power evolving and to be followed very closely is, of course, the story of Saudi Arabia.
Where does a lot of people probably don't know about the Mahdi in Islam. And I believe that the Shiites view the Mahdi as being a person specifically from the 9th century, and whereas the Sunnis view the Mahdi, this messianic figure, not necessarily not being that person. Does messianic eschatology have any bearing on what's taking place with this creation of the caliphate? And the reason I'm asking right now is I'm wondering if I'm American, if I'm Israeli, if I'm Western, is there with the Iranian regime right now, and we're recording this right after 9 people were just killed in Beit Shemesh, and I'm wondering if Iran is gonna say, "Hey, listen, we are thinking about this from the perspective of, this is the end of days in some sort of eschatological way. If you're taking out Khomeini, which they already did, I'm wondering where does someone like an Ali Larjani, and I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly, but the potential successor to Khomeini, where does he think about this? Does he think in an eschatological sort of way? Does he think apocalyptically? How are they thinking about what the future is going to hold? And when the Americans and the Israelis took out their supreme leader.
Well, Noam, let me just start with Larijani. That's the name, Ali Larijani. I don't think that he thinks anymore. Reportedly, he was killed as well.
Okay.
But regarding the issue of the
So,
Mahdi,
even if it's Larry Jani or if it's somebody else, whoever this next person is, um,
regarding this thing that you bring to the discussion, very interesting. The Mahdi, if you want, you can say that the Messiah. You mentioned earlier, and let's just elaborate a little bit for the listeners. We're going back now to the 7th century. We talked about the Sunni-Shia power struggle. We talked about this major branch of denominations of Shia, the 12th one, the 12 leaders, the 12 Imam. Now we are reaching to the last one of them, Muhammad al-Askari, that disappeared, according to the Shia narrative, in the 9th century. Actually, there were 2 periods of this disappearance. One when he was a little boy, and then he disappeared in a couple of years. And then there was the second disappearance, which is known as the bigger disappearance. But here's the point. In the Shia denomination, they believe that he is not dead. They believe that he is alive and waiting outside of time and history. He is known in different names in the Shia narrative. He's known as we'll say it in Arabic and translate, Sahib al-Zaman, which means the master of time. He's known as the anticipated Imam, or the absent Imam, or as the Mahdi, the Messiah. In the perspective or the narratives of the Shia, the time will come, he will summon up to come and to lead mankind to salvation in a bloody process, which is known in Farsi in the names Alaq in Iraq, and which means that will be blood and tears involved. And he will lead mankind to salvation. Most of mankind will perish in that process, but then mankind will reach the ultimate golden shore, obviously under the Shiite denomination. Those narratives are enormously powerful within the Shiite perspectives. The Shiites are deeply, really believing in those things. They are totally identifying emotionally, culturally, politically with those things. You probably are familiar with, for example, there is a very well-known ceremony that Shiites are conducting once a year. It's called the Ta'ziyah. This is a ceremony where you could see Shiite males, starting with young age of 12, walking down the streets in a parade, and they're cutting themselves with knives. They are beating themselves with an iron cable. So the reason they are doing that is because they are materializing the issue, one of the most, if not the most powerful Shiite narratives, and this is the killing of Al-Hussein bin Ali, the son of the Caliph Ali. Hussein bin Ali was the youngest son of Al Khalifa Ali, who was married to 9 women, but his first wife was Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. And together they had 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. The older boy, Hassan, was a caliph for a while, then he stepped down. And his brother, Hussein, that was the last direct male grandson of Prophet Muhammad, claimed the crown of caliphate to himself. His opponents basically had a different perspectives. And then in the year 680, on the 10th day of a month that is called Al-Muharram in Islamic calendar, in a place called Kerbela, which is Iraq of our time, the final battle took place. That day, Ali, Hussein bin Ali and his followers have been butchered. And that became the cornerstone of the story of the tragic component of Shiite belief. They say every day is Ashura, meaning every day is the 10th day of the month, and every place is Kerbela. Basically saying, for us, we are constantly grieving the killing of Hussein bin Ali. And so you could see how deeply entrenched those narratives are within the Shiite denomination. By the way, in that regard, we talked about the Sunnis. The Sunnis basically also talk about the end of days, but differently from the Iranian, the Shiite denomination. The Sunnis don't have a clear visualization or identification of that Messiah when he's going to come. The Shia does. And this is one of the major differences between them. And by the way, talking about the end of days, here is something that I would like to share with the listeners in that time in the context of the Sunnis, to be even more accurate about Hamas. People are talking a lot about the story of genocide and all those things in Gaza Strip. Here is something that Western public opinion is unfamiliar with, and it's interesting opportunity to bring it to the discussion. In September 2021, Hamas, Sunnis again, held an interesting conference in Gaza that was titled by the Arabic name Wa'id al-Akhirah, which means the promise of ends of days. But this is Hamas, the Sunnis, not the Shiite. The conference basically was centered around the question, what is going to happen with the Jews in Israel that will be left after Hamas will eliminate Israel? Which resulted in an interesting 20 articles document that is actually could be perceived or viewed as the blueprint of Hamas for a genocidal agenda. But the title is interesting. The End of Day, Wa'id al-Akhirah. This is the Sunni version. We talked earlier about the Shiite one.
That is fascinating. So from your description, Avi, I totally understand why Israel, a country in the Middle East, the only Jewish country in the world, a country that has around 10 million people, 75% or so being Jewish, I understand why that country would feel anxiety all the time with a country that's in its neighborhood that has 90 million people that does not believe that it should exist, meaning Israel should exist. I understand very simply why Israel would say as it has time and time again, we cannot tolerate the existence of this Iranian government, not the Iranian people, but the Iranian government. And there's a huge distinction between the two. What I want to help understand from your perspective is, why should the United States of America be involved in this? Where does the American impulse to wage, I don't know if it's the right term, is a war, a battle, an assassination, killing, whatever the term is, why should the United States be involved in this when the United States is so far away from Iran? I know that the Jeffersonian neo-isolationists in the United States of America probably are looking at this and saying, wait a second, why should the United States get involved in a war that's so many miles away when we have to take care of our own issues here in the United States of America? And when you look at history, 2003, and you see what the United States of America did with Iraq, many people would argue that they should not have involved themselves in such a war. And it comes across as the United States of America fighting Israel's wars. So help me understand, from your perspective, why it makes sense geopolitically for the United States of America to be involved in a war that is thousands of miles away, when, you know, it's on the Western Hemisphere.
Great question, Noam. And I'll try to sum up my answer very simply. Because in the 21st century, and particularly looking forward, geographical distances have no meaning anymore in every possible aspect. Ideologies are crossing from one place to another, not during days or months, but during nanoseconds. Political ideas, economic transactions, any possible human communication. Geographical distances are totally irrelevant. And that has an enormous ramifications. Let's take, for example, Noam, let's take the story of post-October 7 and Western public opinion. Western public opinion, post-October 7, one could say, what Western public opinion has to do with something that happens thousands of miles away? But we know that Western public opinion is very much involved in the story. In fact, I would say very decisively. Western public opinion is not any longer a spectator in a show. It is proactively involved. Once you are proactively involved, because the geographical distance is irrelevant anymore, because of social media, because of all those things, once you become a proactive player, it means that you are part of the story. And in the context of the Western public opinion, in particularly post-October 7, what we saw was that it has clearly generated a growing polarization within Western public opinion. In other words, something that allegedly, according to the isolationist perspective, is totally irrelevant, became enormously relevant to the Western political fabric, social fabric, cultural fabric, emotional mindset, political discussion, intellectual discussion. So this is one example of many to the fact that isolation is not any longer really relevant in our times. And clearly, when we are looking ahead, we just have around the corner the rise of the biggest empire of them all, which is called AI.
Okay, Avi, I'm gonna let you go. You taught me a lot about the history of the region, different aspects of religious societies in that region, the different levers that are being pulled and why they're being pulled. My last question for you, and then I really will let you go, is, what is your opinion about Iranian public opinion? Are you able to put Iranian public opinion into different buckets? And the reason I'm focused on this as my last question is, I'm a person that is too often on TikTok, Instagram. I admit it, Avi. And I see, depending on the outlet that I'm watching, very different reactions. I see Iranians that are celebrating. and I see Iranians that are in deep mourning. Which one is it? Which one is more prevalent? And what do you think the Iranians are going to be doing over the next few months?
Well, Noam, it's a very accurate observation. You could see both sides of the story or the public opinion. But here is what we should remind ourselves. Majority of the Iranian people are people that were born into the rule of the Mullah regime. This is a 90 million people nation. And this is enormously significant. They were born into this reality. And in course of time, the gap between them, emotionally, intellectually, culturally, and the regime only got wider and wider, particularly, among other things, because of the growing influence of social media, the fact that geographical distance has become irrelevant, and the oppressive character of that brutal regime. So I would say, roughly speaking, that we can say quite decisively that majority of the Iranians would like to get free of that suffocating regime. We have also to remember that on a practical basis, and that across the board, whether you're totally opponent of the regime or you're somewhat supportive of that regime, you are all in the same boat in the sense that the Iranian people are facing an enormous challenges on a daily basis in terms of unemployment, services, electricity, energy, water, all those very things that in the end of the day are everyday life needs. The Mullah regime totally failed in providing these people all those. The only one thing that the Mullah regime excel in is oppressing its own people and exporting violence across the region. So, all in all, when I look at the Iranian people, it's very clear that in the end of the day, if the regime will fall down, overwhelmingly majority of the Iranians are not going to shed a tear. Not as significant is the question what's going to happen if that will be the scenario, and I'm emphasizing the word if right here. But it is very interesting indeed to look closely at the development within the Iranian public opinion and inner discussion, particularly following the current war that is now taking place.
Avi, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining Unpacking Israeli History. And I look forward to being in touch with you much more often. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam, for having me.